Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? So what I wanted to talk about in this video, right, is regarding embryological evidence towards evolutionary theory. So not only does embryological development give evidence towards evolutionary theory by following sequences which are consistent with evolutionary theory and otherwise have no rhyme or reason to them. And, groups starting out like developing something and then it going away, but then in other groups it actually becomes the body part, right? Like, for example, all vertebrates, regardless of if they have a tail or not, develop tails during embryonic development, right? And we know that that's what it is because in all of the vertebrates that have tails, it actually goes on to become the tail that they come out with post-embryonic development, right? But for creatures that do not have tails post-embryonic development, like humans and other apes, right? We first develop this same structure, then in a dog becomes their tail, but then further into development, it goes away, right? But in any event, not only do embryological not only does embryonic development follow patterns that are consistent with evolutionary theory and have no rhyme or reason to them otherwise, right? They also often provide us with the mechanism, right, behind transitioning from one setup of the body to the next, right, one setup to the next, right, because many of the same transitions that happen through the course of evolution are played over every time a new human develops, or, for any creature for that matter, or any organism, right? Much of the changes, right, are played over again every time we develop, right? Which simplifies the mechanism of like, oh, how do we change from this setup that's more like this type of creature to the setup we now have. That transition is played out over again every time we develop, which simplifies the mechanism, right? So to give a good example, so monotremes, reptiles, birds, amphibians, and many groups of fish all have what's called a cloaca, which is a single multi-purpose hole used for peeing, pooing, and reproducing all through one hole, right? But for therian mammals, including humans, we obviously don't have that set up, right? Our anus is a separate hole from where we pee and reproduce. And then also for therian females, including humans, there's two separate holes for peeing and reproducing, urethra and vagina, right? So that's obviously a very different setup. So how could we ever evolutionarily have transitioned from originally having a cloaca to the setup we now have? Well, during embryonic development, therian mammals, including humans, we start out with a cloaca before we ever have the anus or the urogenital holes that we have post-embryonic development. We actually start out with a cloaca, and further into development, it divides into separate holes, right? Giving us the setup that we're born with, right? And so the transition from one setup down there to the other is played out every time we develop. And actually, in some rare cases, a person can even still be born with a cloaca. It does happen in some rare instances. Another good example, the blowhole of whales. There's been a number of instances where I've had creationists point out the blowhole of whales as, you know, something that it doesn't make sense for evolution, that, you know, there's no way for evolution to account for it because it's such a different setup from like the positioning of the nostrils for other vertebrates. But during embryonic development, whales actually start out with their nasal passage at a spot more like that of other mammals, and then the nasal passage, it migrates, it moves back behind the eyes, right? Eventually taking on the position that they're born with, right? So that transition of the positioning of the blowhole is played out every time a new whale develops, right? Another good example. So, all vertebrates, right, develop during embryonic development what's called pharyngeal arches and pharyngeal slits, right? But these develop into very different things in different groups, right? The ones which in fish develop into gills and gill structures, these same ones for us develop into differing body parts like parts of our ears, parts of our jaws. And so, if you were to just like look at our ears, it wouldn't be apparent like, oh, how could you ever like have an evolutionary transition where like gills and gill structures are modified towards instead developing into ears. That wouldn't be apparent just like looking at our ears and a fish's gills, but we see that they share a common developmental origin, right? Thus simplifying the mechanism of that transition, right? And also, so the malleus and incus bones, right, that are unique to the middle ear of mammals, right? There's embryonic evidence that they're derived from the quadrate and articulate bones found in other jawed vertebrates. So mammals do not have the quadrate and articulate bones, which most other jawed vertebrates have, right? But mammals uniquely do have the malleus and incus bones of the middle ear. This applies to all mammals and only mammals. But the malleus and incus bones, right, during embryonic development, in the early stages, they start out at positions more like that of the quadrate and articulate bones, more down towards the jaw area. And then further into development, they migrate into the middle ear, right? In the case of marsupials, which they don't carry their pregnancies for as long of a term, so they're born more quickly. They actually, even within a few weeks after they're born, they still have the malleus and incus bones more down towards the jaw area, and then within like the first few weeks after their birth, it migrates into the middle ear, right? And the malleus and incus bones do also share some of the same genetic instructions that are used for the quadrate and articulate bones, right? And there's also fossil evidence that corroborates that transition as well, right? From early synapsids, right? We have a number of transitional fossils between mammal and reptile fossil species, right? Which showed up before there were ever any true mammals in the fossil record, right? For another good example, so one of the things that's changed position throughout the course of our evolution is our eyes, right? We now have forward-facing eyes, right? Whereas in earlier stages of our evolution, when we were more like fish, our eyes would have been on the sides of the head, right? And if you didn't understand the embryological development, it might confuse you like, oh, how could something like that change? But during embryonic development, our eyes actually start out, when they first form, they start out on the sides of the head, more like a fish. And then further into development, they migrate, they move to the front, right? And for another good example, so the earliest tetrapods likely had webbing between their digits, right? The fingers and toes, webbing of skin and muscle between them, right? So rather than having space between the fingers like I have here, they would have had webbing of skin and muscle between them, right? And we still see this in some groups, like a lot of frogs, it's like that, right? Um, but so in any event, the evolutionary transition from one step to the next, the physical mechanism of changing that, it's played over every time a new human develops, right? Because when our fingers and toes first develop, they have webbing of skin and muscle between them, right? Only further into development, the spaces form, right? It's separated with no skin or muscle between. And it is also still something that happens, that a person can in some instances be born like that, where they have webbing between their fingers and toes. Because of the fact that the genetic instructions for having it be like that are still there, we do have some groups of tetrapods that have re-evolved that condition as well. A number of groups that have. So the mechanism for that change, right, is simplified when we see, right, that it's played over every time a new human develops, right? Or, for that matter, anytime a new dog develops, right? Another example, so all of the regions of the digestive tract, right, as well as the trachea, bronchi, and lungs, they all share a common developmental origin embryologically. When the gut tube first forms in the embryo, it doesn't have any specialized regions. It's a tube with no specialized regions. Only further into development, different regions of it specialize towards different purposes, giving us not only all of the organs of the digestive tract, but also the trachea, bronchi, and lungs are also derived from the embryonic gut tube, right? And so this simplifies like the mechanisms of like evolving those organs, right? Because it all shares a common embryological origin, right? And also with these differing body parts that share common embryological origins, they also share common genetic origins, right? Much of the same genetic instructions, right? And so, much of the trend, like creationists, right, will oftentimes want to focus on like the body of a like a fully grown adult organism, and compare the differences and be like, oh, look at me and a chimp, and our bodies are so different, even though they're much more similar than different, but there's a lot of difference. And so how could we look so different in some ways, so how could we be related? But the much of the changes that have occurred through evolution, right, are played out every time a new human develops, or a new chimp, or a new dog, whatever, right? Every time a new one develops, the changes of the body are played over again, right? And so rather than focusing on like the differences of the adult organisms, which is just it's just as much a matter of embryology, developmental biology, as it is a matter of evolution, Instead, you would more so want to focus on the genetic instructions, right? That's more so more directly what evolution addresses, right? Um, the changes of the body, right, are played out every time a new much of them are played out every time a new human develops. And we start out as a single cell, right? In our earliest stage, we're a single cell, not even a clump of cells, just one single cell, only one cell alone. From there, you gradually grow and develop all of the features that you have on the multicellular level. And almost every single cell in the body shares the same exact genetic instructions, right? But the differing genes are just turned on and off in differing regions of the body, right? And so yeah, well, and we also see, right, that much of the same genetic instructions, right, can be used in multiple spots across the body, right? There are genetic mutations that can change the spots of a body part, right? Like there are even mutations that can make a fly grow legs out of its head where its antennas can be, right? Mutations can change the positioning of body parts, the number of body parts, etc., etc. And so um also, in the early stages of development, there are special cells, right, which have the ability to develop into any kind of cell, right? They could develop into bone cell, nerve cell, muscle cell, etc., any specific type of cell, but they don't start out as any specific type of cell, right? So much of the mechanisms, right, for like change from one body form to the other, when we're talking about like the form of the body itself, right, it's as much a matter of developmental biology addressing it as a matter of evolution, right? And you obviously have to factor in the developmental process and not just look at like the end product and like, oh, this is what a fully grown human looks like, but look at the stages of how our body grows. Differing parts move around throughout the course of development. Parts move around, they change their shape, size, some parts go away, etc., etc. Also something else that's interesting. So something else that like mirrors our evolution in the course of our embryonic development is something that had to change through the course of our evolution is the positioning of the backbone, right? The backbone for humans enters the skull much more directly under it compared to a chimp. It's further back. A dog, it's even further back. It's even further back on their skull that the backbone enters it, right? But during embryonic development in the early stages, the backbone enters the skull further back at a spot more like that of a dog, right? And then further into development, it migrates its position, right? And we also see, right, that when a person is first born, they have a lot more bones than when they're an adult, right? Significantly more. Many of the bones fuse together further into development. So someone newly born has a lot more bones than someone as an adult. And even more so during embryonic development in the early stages, there's a lot more bones than the amount of bones you're born with, right? And many of the bones that you have in the early stages of development correspond to bones of other groups, right, that our groups have now changed the setup, right? But in the early stages, we still have that same bone setup, right? So, that's all for now. See you guys.